I am excited about this next series of episodes. Why? Because we are going to talk about race. We're going to talk about what it means to be professionals of color who are working in white dominant career paths or who are just trying to be, quote, professionals when we have brown skin. And this world was not created for us to reach that status. Hey, and welcome to Impostrix Podcast. My name is Whitney Knoxley, and I'm your host. Here at Impostrix Podcast, we affirm the experiences of professionals of color who navigate imposter syndrome or imposter treatment and racial toxicity at work and in their careers. This episode is an asked and answered episode where I'm going to be talking solo about a subject, a topic, answering a question that listeners have posed. This episode is all about learning and really engaging with you all. So let's jump in. So what is race? Race is a social construct that's developed over time since colonization. It's been used to distinguish between those with power and those without. And oftentimes today, when we talk about race, we're talking about Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, Latino, Indigenous. So those are kind of the categories that have been developed over time. And these categories, these racial groups, have been divided by their physical characteristics, but also by their cultural background and social factors. As I said, race has been developed over time. And that's happened through American law and jurisprudence, including landmark Supreme Court decisions, deciding who is white and who isn't white, and key legislation granting citizenship to some people, but not others, and also through local laws like Jim Crow. And some of those landmark Supreme Court decisions or legislation came in the form of, say, the Declaration of Independence in 1776, when Thomas Jefferson said that all men were created equal except for enslaved Africans, which isn't surprising considering Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. The Naturalization Act of 1790 was the first legislation granting European immigrants rights to citizenship, and the initial Naturalization Act only required 2 years of living in the United States or the colonies for European immigrants to be eligible for naturalization. It wasn't until much later that other racial groups became eligible for naturalization. And then we have the 1830 Indian Removal Act, where indigenous folks were forced off of their lands and made to move west in what we now call the Trail of Tears. This was a massive genocide movement against one racial group. And it's one of the times where in our history, we have identified a racial group and then determined what their rights are based off of their race. In 1922 is a case Ozawa versus the United States. Ozawa was someone who had lived in the United States for 20 years and was trying to gain citizenship through naturalization. So he brought this court case, and the Supreme Court held that Japanese folks were not considered Caucasian in the ordinary use of the term, so they were not free white persons, and therefore they did not have a path to citizenship through the naturalization laws. Black people gained their citizenship through the 14th Amendment in 1868, and Indigenous people in 1924 with the Indian Citizenship Act. And while some Asian groups were able to get citizenship prior to 1952, it wasn't until 1952's Walter McCarran Act that nullified all of the federal anti-Asian exclusion laws and allowed for naturalization of all of all Asians. And without the citizenship, there's no right to vote, there's no right to own property, and there's no right to bring lawsuits. So I mention this history because I think the context of race and where we are coming from when we're entering these workplaces that are multicultural and multiracial is really important. I'm, as I said earlier, not going to go into depth into this right now, but this is just a brief overview of how our racial groups have been defined and identified throughout our history. And although race is a social construct, as you can see, it has very, very real impacts and effects on people in their lives. Everything from being able to access housing and loans for mortgages to your safety and whether or not you need to follow the instructions to a T if you're pulled over by a police officer. So, our race has a very real effect on how we are treated, what rights and privileges we are granted, and what disadvantages we're going to face in our life. And I'll talk a little bit more about what race has to do with work here shortly. So, I want to talk now about racial toxicity because that's the thing. That's the thing that many of us experience, whether we know that we're experiencing it or not. And we experience it whether other people who are making the environment toxic for us know that that's what they're doing. So, just a regular toxic work environment without necessarily moving into the racial aspect of it can include sexual harassment, intimidation, and bullying, discrimination, like racial discrimination or gender discrimination. And it can also include unwarranted and inappropriate comments. The culture of the workplace might be a culture where overwork is encouraged, but maybe you're not compensated for that overwork. Retaliation and fear of retaliation is big in toxic work environments. So when you're experiencing something like sexual harassment and you are afraid to talk about it or to bring it up because of this fear of retaliation, that's another telltale sign of a toxic work environment. So now let's talk about racial toxicity specifically. Racial toxicity at work can manifest in various ways, and it creates a challenging environment for professionals of color. You're probably familiar with the term microaggression. If you're like me, you have seen this video of a person walking around getting bit by mosquitoes, and the one mosquito bite is annoying, but it's not such a big deal. But then a swarm of mosquitoes comes and stings or bites this person. And before you know it, it's a huge deal, a medical emergency, even. So I like that illustration of microaggressions because they're subtle, sometimes unintentional comments or actions that convey discriminatory attitudes or stereotypes. Common examples of this might be comments about somebody's appearance, assuming that they represent an entire racial or ethnic group, and asking insensitive questions. I actually view microaggressions just as aggressions. I don't really separate microaggression from aggression anymore because how I experience these aggressions is pretty impactful every time. So I want to bring up a couple of other examples that may be a little more difficult for folks to identify or for you to identify. And so one of these examples is when you are someone, a person of color, feeling like you are being questioned or your judgment is being questioned at higher rates than other people. In fact, women of color are more likely to have their judgment questioned in the area of their expertise and to be asked to provide additional evidence of their competence. That's a microaggression. I've had experiences where I've felt like I've needed to overshow my work or over explain my opinion, and that it's being questioned at a much higher rate than my white counterparts. Other forms of microaggressions in the workplace can be being mistaken for someone at a lower level of experience or expertise. So for me, that happens when I go into courtrooms, and sometimes I'm mistaken as a legal secretary or assistant or a paralegal or the person that has the legal matter in court, the defendant or the client or whoever the accused, instead of the assumption that I'm the attorney. So something that I do to insulate myself from that perception is I always wear a suit when I go into court. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. Another type of microaggression is racial gaslighting. And this happens when maybe you're trying to explain something, specifically when you're trying to point out something that you think happened based on your race, some experience that you had, or some feeling and impact that you felt based off of somebody else's comments or statements. And the person that you're saying these things to is telling you that you're being overly sensitive, or that person didn't mean it that way, or that's just Joe. Joe says those things. That's racial gaslighting. So, unequal opportunities. Of course, we know that professionals of color face disparities in job assignments, promotion, access to training and development. They also just face disparities in getting the job. CBS reported that people with ethnic sounding names are 50% less likely to get callbacks after submitting their job application using their name. So we know that if you are somebody who has an ethnic sounding name, then you might be taking measures to shield yourself from that bias. And speaking of bias, implicit bias is the next thing that I want to talk about. Implicit bias are unconscious preferences for specific groups and aversions toward other groups. Often we talk about implicit bias in race, but we can hold implicit biases in various areas, including ability or disability, physical body type and fat phobia, religion and culture, and gender. We can have biases preferring one gender over another gender. And one way that this shows up, particularly in media, is the overcriminalization of Black people. This leads the mainstream public to believe that Black people are more likely to be violent and involved in crime than other racial groups. And on the flip side, we may have preferential bias towards white people. And in doing so, we may unconsciously find ourselves valuing the opinions of white people more or censoring white people more. Implicit bias can affect hiring decisions, performance evaluations, interactions in the workplace, and they lead to discrimination against folks of color. So, what does this actually look like? What are examples of implicit bias at work? 40% of Black women find that they need to provide more evidence of their competence when they're making decisions or when they're operating within the workplace. This is compared to 30% of all women feeling like they need to provide evidence of their competence, and 28% of white women, and 14% of men. So, in other words, Black women are more likely to feel as though they need to provide more evidence as to their competence in relation to their counterparts in the workplace. We also struggle as Black women with the angry Black woman myth. This is a bias that's rooted in racism and sexism. And although Black women do not experience anger at rates any different from anybody else, when we do experience anger, people fixate on our tone. One study found that Black women who were perceived as angry tended to receive lower evaluation ratings and lower recommended raises. Now, I've experienced this. I have absolutely experienced someone telling me that they didn't like the tone that I used in an email, or they don't like the tone that I use when I'm asking them a question. Now, when I say the words, when the words come out of my mouth, or when I type the things, there's no tone on my end. But when somebody else is reading something or hearing something and they assign a tone to me that is not there, that's when the bias of the angry Black woman comes in. Black men also report being told that they're being too aggressive or too proactive or too arrogant when their white counterpart may do the same actions or have the same amount of assertiveness and not be called too aggressive. In fact, they'll be applauded and praised for their hard work ethic or their go-getter attitude. Racial slurs and harassment is another form of racial toxicity that we might experience, as well as exclusion, being left out of important meetings or social events. So stereotyping is another big one. People of color may be unfairly stereotyped, which can lead to expectations or judgments based on these stereotypes rather than individual abilities and qualifications. What do I mean by this? A good example is that when a Black woman succeeds, people often attribute her accomplishments to factors outside of their control, like affirmative action or getting help from others, or even just random chance and luck. So, for example, a colleague might say, she only got that promotion because she's Black, or she was lucky to have that outcome. These types of comments reinforce the damaging stereotype that portray Black women as less talented and less competent than their peers. We know about pay inequity, and yes, that is a huge issue. Women of color make up anywhere from 51 cents to the dollar that a white man makes to 80 cents to the dollar of a white man. And that's with Asian women being at the 80 cents to the dollar and Native American women being at 51 cents to the dollar and everybody else in between. And so it's interesting to think about, I think, talking about racial toxicity in the workplace and the dynamics that might present themselves when we're working in an environment where white men hold most of the power and women of color in particular, and Black and Indigenous women specifically, have less power than anybody else. And not only do they have less power, but they also have less money. So to me, it seems like a reinforcing cycle of valuing and centering white people and white power and devaluing and decentering people of color. N- And that happens both in the boardroom, but also in our pockets and with the amount of money that we're making, with what we're able to afford as far as childcare goes, or as far as housing goes and transportation. And all of the areas of our work life and our personal lives that are affected by just those two things, our power and status at work and the amount of money that we're paid at work. But lack of representation is also one of the big ones. So when there's a lack in diversity in leadership roles and decision-making positions, but also just when there's a lack of representation of other people who look like me, who are working alongside me, who are my peers, this can perpetuate racial toxicity as voices and perspectives of people of color are not adequately being represented. This can lead people to think that they speak for their entire race or to have that feeling. And it's not that we think that that's true. It's the position that we feel like we're in. I don't know if you've had this experience, but I certainly have, where I might be the only Black person in the room or the only Black woman in the room. A question is asked. I'm looking around waiting for somebody to say something. Nobody says anything, so I raise my hand to say something. And it's like, okay, now I'm not trying to speak for my race. All I'm trying to say is, so 54% of African American women say that they are the only or one of a few Black women in their work environment. That's more than half. So more than half of Black women who are listening to this show are the only one or one of a few Black women in their work environment. That's so isolating. And in fact, I moved from Seattle to Georgia so that I would not have to be one of that 54%. For every 100 men promoted to manager, only 58 Black women are promoted, despite the fact that Black women ask for promotions at the same rate as men. And for every 100 men hired into manager roles, only 64 Black women are hired. So this means that there are fewer Black women to promote at every level, and the representation gap gets wider and wider. Why does this matter? For me, it matters because to feel supported, to feel seen, to feel like I can be my whole self when I come into work, I want to see that there are other people looking like me. And in fact, 81% of Black women in a recent LinkedIn study reported that same thing, that they are going to feel like there's a more inclusive work environment if they see other people who look like them at work. Like, is that too much to ask? Is it too much to ask? I don't think it is. Surely our hiring managers can find Black people, Asian people, Hispanic people, Indigenous people to fill these roles. And frankly, I'm real tired of hiring managers saying they can't find any person of color who is qualified. That just means you're not looking hard enough. When we don't have representation, we fall into this token role. And that's that role that I was describing earlier, where we feel like we're speaking for the whole team. Being the only person of color in a workplace or team and feeling like you were hired just to fulfill a diversity quota can lead to feelings of isolation and being undervalued. Yes. Have you felt that way? I've felt that way. And I've had situations where people have told me that I was hired as basically a diversity hire. But that's a different conversation. The last one that I want to talk about is cultural appropriation. And this occurs when elements of somebody's culture, often from marginalized communities, are borrowed or imitated without proper acknowledgement or respect due. Working in a space where there's cultural appropriation happening particularly if it's appropriation of your own culture, can be particularly damaging and isolating and really just uncomfortable. That that is an uncomfortable environment. And oftentimes we may not feel like we have the power to stand up and say something, especially if this is like an event that's happening or a gathering or get together where we might be having to stand up to multiple people, not just one person. So, all of these examples and all of the things that I've just talked about are ways that racial toxicity can show up in our workplace. And some of these things, like microaggression and implicit bias, we talk about in contexts not relating necessarily to racial toxicity, or rather, we don't assign those characteristics to racial toxicity. But I'm here to tell you that if you're experiencing any of those things in the workplace, then what you're experiencing is, in fact, racial toxicity. And it's okay to call it that. It's okay to call the thing, and this thing is racial toxicity. So now let's talk about racial discrimination. And certainly some of the things that I've talked about, like the racial slurs and harassment and pay inequity at times, some of these things certainly can rise to the level of racial discrimination. So, racial discrimination is a legal term of art. The EEOC defines racial discrimination as the unlawful harassment of a person because of that person's race or color. And they say harassment includes racial slurs, offensive or derogatory remarks about a person's race or color, or displaying racially offensive symbols. So, if you are somebody who is experiencing racial toxicity and you think that that racial toxicity rises to the level of racial discrimination, there are options for you. And I encourage you to check out the EEOC website and find out some next steps that you can take if you want to find yourself some protection there. So, how do we know that the toxicity that we might be experiencing at work is racial toxicity, as opposed to just your standard toxic work environment? Sometimes you won't. Sometimes you just won't know because sometimes people aren't going to say, oh, hey, Black person, and then make their ridiculous comment. But oftentimes, if you are feeling something and you are feeling that the workplace is toxic because you are Black, because you are Asian, because you are Indigenous, because you are Hispanic, then I think you can trust that gut. We, as people of color, are often gaslit, like I said before, and told that we're being overly sensitive. And we are trained not to trust our intuition around when somebody has a racial bias against us or when somebody is making decisions based on how we look instead of on our competency. I think we can just trust our gut. But here is where it's helpful to start writing things down and tracking what you're experiencing and tracking the conversations that you're having with people and tracking how those experiences or, your complaints are being resolved or if they're being resolved. You may not choose to do anything with what you're experiencing. You may choose to just leave your work environment or you may choose to ignore it. And that's fine. That's your decision. But I think the question should be less for us whether or not it's racial toxicity and just an acknowledgement that something doesn't feel right to us. Let me investigate it. So, what can you do if you are somebody who's experiencing racial toxicity? This is why I'm so excited about the next several episodes that are coming up, because this month I'm focusing entirely on racial toxicity and how folks in their careers have navigated that. As you listen to the upcoming episodes, I hope that you get good nuggets out of those episodes. And I hope that you take away actionable tools that can help you with your self advocacy. But for now, here are some things that I thought of as ways for you to address racial toxicity that you might be experiencing. So the first is document your evidence. What I mean by that is if you encounter someone and you have an interaction or you're walking into a space that you feel like isn't safe for you, write out what it is that you're experiencing, how it made you feel, whether it had an impact on you and your work, and then write out like who all was involved, and just keep those notes for yourself. Remove yourself from the toxic environment if that's an option. And this can be everything from deciding to work from home today or this week, or going ahead and finding another job. Lean on your friends, your allies, your mentors, and your sponsors. So in the space, be the change that you want to see. If you are experiencing something, then there's a good chance that somebody else is experiencing something. So what I've done in the past is really leaned on my colleagues who may also be experiencing something in the workplace. And in fact, I found out many times that they are, and we're able to be allies for each other. We're able to support each other when support is needed. We're able to bounce things off of each other, to validate each other. That's really important. Mentors and sponsors are great because maybe they've been through it before and they can give you their experience and their tips on what to do next. Maybe they can start looking out for a different role for you, and you might be able to capitalize on that opportunity. Identify and prioritize your values and focus on working and operating in a way that's in line with those values. So, how can you bring yourself back into alignment with your values if you are no longer there? That's helpful for me because it's essentially doing the work in a way that's aligned with my values, with why I'm even here in the first place, and focusing on that, focusing on my own goals, my own progress, my own cases, or whatever that may be, to kind of take some of the focus off of all of this other BS that's happening around me. Seek opportunity to express your experience using the evidence that you have documented, and then follow up in email. So, this is the other part about documenting what you're experiencing. If you're going to have a conversation with somebody, maybe you have a meeting, maybe you've had like an accountability meeting, or you've had a quarterly review or something of that nature, I definitely encourage that you follow up that meeting with an email. And in that email, go over, the highlights, the bullet points that were discussed during that meeting. So, for example, if this is a time where maybe you met with HR because you experienced some aggression and you wanted to get support from HR, you can then follow up with HR in writing saying, "Good morning, Sally. Thank you so much for meeting with me today. We talked about this experience that I had on April 17th, 2023. You suggested a couple of things that I can do, which are X, Y, and Z. You also said that per company policy ABCD. I look forward to following up with you about this in the future. If there's any more information that you need from me, please let me know." So, what have you done by that email? You've documented that you've had a meeting with HR. You've documented that something happened that required you to have a meeting with HR. You've documented the feedback that you've received from HR and the anticipated next steps, so that if this continues to happen, you can go back to that email and say, "Hey, Sally, per our last email from June 15th, 2023, we discussed X, Y, and Z. Unfortunately, I haven't seen much change to the situation. I'm looking for your support. Period." Okay. If the interaction arises or the interactions arise to racial discrimination, you can speak to your HR or other identified people within the organization. So if there's a DEI manager, director, liaison, consultant, you can speak to them and find support there. If you're having issue with somebody in one of those roles that you would normally be reporting to, one of my friends recently suggested to just send an email to that person and CC the board. If you work for an organization that has a board, bring them in. Understanding, of course, that any communication that you have with your organization regarding racial discrimination or racial toxicity may put you at risk of retaliation. That's real. There's no way around that. That's real. However, if you're somebody that wants to take that risk and you don't know who else to reach out to, consider reaching out to the board or consider consulting with an EEO attorney or advocate so that you can find out what your rights are in this situation. You can be validated as to whether or not this was actually discrimination, and you can be told your options by a third party. And I also think it's really important, in addition to these kind of like nuts and bolts things that we can do, is to really find ways to care for ourselves. So find healthy stress release and beef up your self-care. I don't mean go to the bar and get drunk. Maybe that's what you do tonight, fine. But like tomorrow, the situation is still going to be there. So what can we do to relieve some of our stress, to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves? And somebody recently asked me, we were talking about this racial toxicity at work and what you do. And when you leave, like how do you know when it's time to leave? And the question that they raised was, what do I need to do to protect myself so that when I leave this workplace, I am not a diminished version of myself? So whether you decide that you do need to leave this workplace and you need to leave the workplace today, or if you want to leave the workplace in 6 months from now, figure out what self-care actions, steps, what boundaries you need to have in your life so that at the point when you leave this workplace, you're not leaving a diminished version of yourself. Affirm and validate yourself and know that this is a them problem. You are okay. You are more than okay. And this is not something that you need to internalize as something that you did wrong. And this is where I lean on my sister circle a lot for this validation. And sometimes I have affirmations for myself that I'll say. Sometimes I'll read inspiring articles or journal prompts to help me validate myself and keep my confidence. And then the last thing that I'll say is use the remaining time that you have at that organization for self-development and growth. So, I mean, if you think that you're going to leave, or if you think that you're going to be fired, or if you think that you're going to be laid off, go ahead and get that CLE hour, get that training that's $100 that you don't want to have to pay for out of pocket. Go ahead and swipe your card or, get that approved by your employer. As long as it's related to the job, it's a training that will help you move forward. Go ahead and use that organization's resources for self-development and for your own growth. There is nothing wrong with that. All right, y'all. So what have we covered today? We talked about what is race very, very briefly. We talked about what racial toxicity can look like at work and what racial discrimination is. And then we talked about some things that you might consider doing if you're in an environment that you find is racially toxic. Coming up over the next few weeks, we are going to have several conversations, one with a neuropsychologist, one with a doctor and public health expert, DEI consultants, and we're going to talk all about how racial toxicity affects us, how it affects us on our day-to-day life, but also how it affects our brain chemistry. And we're going to talk about what we can do and what other people have done to insulate themselves from the harm that racial toxicity can cause. I hope that you'll join us. I look forward to these next episodes. Until next time, be validated. And that's a wrap on today's episode of Impostrix Podcast. You've just listened to an asked and answered session where I've talked about a topic that is of interest to you. And this was a solo episode. Our playlist has all sorts of content that includes solo episodes with just myself and also episodes with guests. So feel free to scroll through, find a topic that you're interested in, and listen. If you have questions or comments that you want me to answer, feel free to shoot me a DM on Instagram at Impostrix Podcast or to send me an email at impostrixpodcast@gmail.com. You can also go to my website, www.impostrixpodcast.com, and do the little speak pipe thing, which allows you to record a voice message and leave me a message. I'll do my best to respond. I'm so grateful for the time that you spent with me today. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to share with your friends and with your family and with your colleagues. I'm excited at this thing that we're creating, and it takes both of us. So thank you.